Let's get the very latest from MS Now contributor Inzamam Rashid in Dubai. MS Now's Jackie Alemany at the White House, Laura Rosen, author of Diplomatic on Substack, and former CIA officer Mark Polymeropoulos, and MS Now national security analyst. Inzamam, more than a full day into this U.S. blockade of Iran's ports and coastline, is it having any impact? What's the state of traffic right now in the Strait of Hormuz?
I don't think it is having any impact whatsoever. Yes, there are a lot of U.S. Navy vessels around the Gulf waters. They are ready to essentially get onto the Strait of Hormuz and do whatever President Trump wants them to do, whether that's kind of surround Iranian ports, whether that's actually get near to Iranian vessels that would be coming in and out of the coastline of Iran. But the current impact is very limited, and that's because we've seen Iranian vessels pass through the Strait of Hormuz today. There were at least 4 Iranian-linked ships, including 2 that visited Iranian ports that crossed the Strait of Hormuz today. And there were also 3 others that crossed this key shipping canal. And so I don't really think that there is any direct impact yet of this U.S. blockade, even though it came into force yesterday. And I think that there is still not an understanding or a real understanding or a grasp of exactly how this blockade would work. There are apparently more U.S. Navy forces on the way to the Strait of Hormuz, to that particular area. And I think President Trump may be hoping and wishing that other countries, perhaps Gulf nations, will be there to support his efforts on that waterway as well. I think what's important is that whilst Iranian tankers have passed through the Strait of Hormuz today, it technically, the U.S. is not blockading that water, despite what the president has said. Instead, kind of aiming to blockade Iran's Gulf ports by operating its navy in the Gulf of Oman and the Indian Ocean as well, rather than kind of risking its vessels going near to the Iranian coastline, because they very well could be targeted by Iranian missiles, by Iranian drones on that water. And remember as well, Iran is still threatening the fact that they have planted around a dozen or so mines in the Strait of Hormuz. So if there are U.S. Navy vessels, they claim, that go near to the Iranian coastline, well, then they could be struck by mines as well. Just one final point as well, Anna, which I think is important. China's foreign ministry has specifically condemned this blockade of Iranian ports by the U.S. They have said that this is dangerous and irresponsible. They, of course, would say that because China gets a huge amount of its oil directly from Iran and has been benefiting massively over the last 6 weeks since this Iranian closure of the Strait of Hormuz has been in place. So China definitely unhappy with any U.S. efforts to interfere with them receiving oil. For now, though, it seems like, as it was a good few days ago, Iran's still managing to get a few vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, and there doesn't really seem to be much action on that very narrow waterway. Anna.
And I had thought the Trump administration said reopening freely the Strait of Hormuz was a requirement of the ceasefire agreement. Laura, yet we're seeing things move the opposite direction with a tightening down further in the strait. How much does this U.S. blockade raise the stakes in this conflict?
And the fact that even though Vice President Vance, announced they didn't get an agreement in Islamabad, that there seems to be an awful lot of diplomatic activity happening behind the scenes. Talk of perhaps another meeting, another U.S.-Iran meeting, maybe in Islamabad, maybe somewhere else. Also, these reports that the U.S. proposed Iran suspends enrichment for 20 years and Iran proposed 5. That seems like you're getting to an area where you could start to negotiate. That's not never. And so I actually would not be surprised to hear that there are resumed talks in the next few days.
Jackie, bring us up to speed on the updates related to any additional negotiations. What are we learning this morning? What's the White House saying?
Yeah, Anna, good morning. Now, nothing has been finalized here, but there are a second round of negotiations that are currently under consideration. But overall, there's been a lot of pretty intense secrecy around the 21-hour visit that the vice president and U.S. negotiators Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner took to Islamabad to sit down with the Pakistanis and the Iranians. Caroline Levitt, though, at the White House yesterday did say that the White House and negotiating teams have been very clear about their red lines. And Vice President J.D. Vance went on Fox News to share a little bit more about what those red lines look like exactly, and said that essentially everything stems from the fact that the U.S. wants to make sure that Iran does not have access to a nuclear weapon. This is the red line that has existed for months, if not years at this point. He also shared a few new details, including that the conversations helped clarify some of the U.S. priorities, including reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which I was surprised to see J.D. Vance conceded that that has not happened at this moment, and that it was a goalpost that the Iranians kept shifting during the negotiations over the weekend. But here's a little bit more from that interview, actually. Let's give it a watch.
We did make some progress in the negotiation. The big question from here on out is whether the Iranians will have enough flexibility, whether the Iranians will accept the critical things that we need to see in order for things to get done. Whether we have further conversations, whether we ultimately get to a deal, I really think the ball is in the Iranian court because we put a lot on the table.
A senior administration official did confirm to MS Now that Iran did ultimately reject the 20-year suspension offered by the United States, which was a way for the Iranians to claim that they hadn't completely given up their nuclear program. They have countered, the Iranians have countered, with a 3-year proposal, according to this senior administration official. But this is the proposal, the offer that was given from the Iranians to the United States in February to negotiators when those conversations were happening in Geneva prior to the collapse of those talks and right before President Trump decided he was going to go to war with Iran. So it remains to be seen where things go from here. There are still a lot of other big sticking points that remain, some which are being now hashed out by Lebanon and Israel right over at the State Department. And we are keeping a close eye on whether or not the U.S. delegation decides to go over to Islamabad yet again.
So, Mark, they're talking, it sounds like, and there are these competing proposals, which we're learning more details about, 3 years or 20 years when it comes to pausing enriching uranium. The U.S. already had a nuclear deal with Iran, which President Trump eliminated in his first term. That was pumping the brakes, remember, on the whole nuclear program. Do you see the U.S. ultimately winding up in a scenario where it is renegotiating the same deal it already had 10 years ago?
Well, that's a great question, Anna. And, I'm smiling only in the sense of, a lot of us thought if there was ever going to be any progress on this, you would essentially have to have, that's the JCPOA 2.0. That's the old Obama deal and perhaps strengthened. But don't forget, President Trump and many others have said, Iran can have no enrichment of uranium whatsoever, except we apparently offered a 20-year moratorium on this. Again, as you noted, the Iranians countered. But I think you're getting to the point of, the idea of maximalist positions on both sides. That's the beginning of the negotiations. J.D. Vance went home. This is akin to buying a rug in the souk in Damascus, in the market in Damascus or Cairo. You have this a price, you kind of say, and then you walk off. But then you come back and negotiate further. So this is going to cause problems for Trump politically if they do go down this line, but it's probably where it has to go if you don't want to resume the war. The U.S. is going to have to give a little bit, as is Iran. And so the notion that there are negotiations about not no enrichment, but whether or when it can be done, pretty remarkable, because that's a big move away from previous U.S. positions. But I think that's where this is going. And at some point, if we do agree on this, Trump's going to have to sell to a lot of people that this was somehow much stronger, much different than the Obama deal, but it just might be actually an extension of it. That might not be a bad thing, but I think that's where we're going.
Inzamam, meanwhile, today here in Washington, high-stake talks for the first time in decades between Israel and Lebanon. What's on the line?
Well, look, whilst these two ambassadors are in Washington having these, as you mentioned, high-stakes talk, and it's the first time in decades, I think, these two countries have essentially been in the room together to have a conversation. Well, Israel continues to bomb Lebanon here in the region. And so, yes, you may well have diplomatic conversations going on to some form of peace talks, but here you've still got fighting continuing. I also today spoke to the Israeli ambassador here in the UAE, the first time he'd actually had a conversation with journalists since this conflict began. And he told me directly that the issue of Iran needs to be solved before they can solve any issue with Lebanon. So I'm not entirely confident that these talks in Washington will amount to anything. Yes, there might be a real buzz around it, that this is a great move, it's a good step forward. But when you've still got fighting continuing in the region, when you've still got everyday people dying, and remember, Israel isn't specifically targeting just the Hezbollah regime, the Iranian proxies. They are also killing women and children, something, again, which I put to the Israeli ambassador today, which got his skin up a little bit. And he said that they're very much just targeting Hezbollah and not specifically killing women and children. He basically said if they're in the area, then so be it. But look, a positive step, I think, what will happen in Washington today. But whilst you've got the fighting going on, Anna, it's hard to see how those talks go anywhere.
Mark, what are you watching for out of these talks?
I mean, look, I agree that this is a good step. Let's note that the Israelis did not want to do this. President Trump forced them to come to the table. I think there's a lot of people in Israel who do really question whether Israel can afford another front. Of course, they've been fighting with Iran for over a month. And so now they've invaded again southern Lebanon. And so at some point, kind of this never-ending war is enough is enough. But I do think that I'm looking to see the amount of pressure the Trump administration places on Israel to potentially get to a ceasefire. I think that is the only way this will occur.